Tom Marotta. Tom is a passionate thinker, writer, and editor and advocate for all things space, especially space settlement. He is currently the policy program manager at the Federal Aviation Administration, where he identifies issues that may impact public safety in the commercial space transportation industry. He's a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who served in Iraq, West Africa, and Europe. He is the award-winning co-author of The High Frontier, my apologies, An Easier Way. And he is the co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute, a 501c3 think tank focused on advancing the establishment of economically vibrant communities in space for the benefit of humanity. He's doing a lot of interesting work, and I look forward to learning more. Without further ado, please welcome Tom Marotta.
Thank you, Layla. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just let's do a quick comm check. Can you hear me? Can you get a thumbs up if you hear me all right? Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yep, Tom Marotta. I'm going to get this started by asking a question. How many space stations do you think will exist 10 years from today on December 9th, 2030? How many will we have, right? So Michael Lane is an old friend of mine. He asked me to talk about space stations. So this is going to be the framework within which we have our little presentation today. So again, Layla kind of went through this, but yeah, I'm the policy program manager at the Office of Commercial Space Transportation within the FAA. Everything that I'm talking about here today, though, is my own opinion. I am not here. I'm not on the government time right now. This is not U.S. government policy. So disclaimer delivered. I am the co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute. We have an event on the 16th. You can check us out at beyondearth.org. A lot of what we do there is dealing with infrastructure in space and frankly, how to get more space stations and really, to the bottom line, how to get more people living in space. I'm also the co-author of a book that deals a lot with space station policy, space stations as precursors to space settlements, or what we like to call communities beyond Earth. You can check out my book on Amazon if you like. So here's what I'm going to go through. I believe I have about 20 minutes. So I am highly caffeinated. I'm a New Yorker born and bred. So I'm going to be speaking very quickly. This is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to define a space station. So we're all working from the same sheet of music. We're going to talk about what space stations are in existence today. We're going to talk about space stations that are planned over the next 10 years. We're going to talk about how those space stations support themselves. And then we're going to talk about what disruptions or what changes we might like to see to see a lot more space stations, right? Because that's really what I'm most interested in, as Layla alluded to. I see there's a bunch of chat questions here. In any case, Layla, you let me know if there's something in the chat that I need to know about. But I guess my point is, in terms of disruptions, I'd like to see a lot more people living in space. And so in the last section, we'll talk about what things that might change in order to do that. So what is a space station? Here's a definition that I propose. We can talk about it in the discussion later, but I call it right here. I'll have you read it and I'll walk through it. A habitable facility, right? It has to be a place where people can live, where life could be supported. We're not talking about uncrewed platforms like a satellite, right? A space station is where life can support life. It's where work is accomplished, pretty straightforward. And that last clause there, it remains in space for months or years at a time. If we think of a Dragon capsule, a space capsule, or even going all the way back to the old Gemini capsule, well, that's a habitable facility, and work is accomplished in that habitable facility, but it only remains in space. A Dragon capsule can only remain in space for less than 2 weeks before it either needs to come back home or attach to the space station to get consumables and power. So this idea that a space station is an enduring platform in space is very, very important. So what space stations currently exist? Well, there's only one. It's the International Space Station, good old ISS. I think everybody on this call is familiar with it. I'm not going to get into the statistics of how big it is and how expensive it was. It's pretty big and it was very expensive. But I'm going to leave you guys with two things that I think might be thought-provoking and discussion-provoking later on. There's a lot of talk in the news about decommissioning the ISS. Current law states that Congress is authorized to provide funding to the ISS only through 2024. So according to current law, it will be decommissioned in 2024. Almost nobody thinks that's actually going to happen. There are proposed bills in both houses of Congress to extend it to 2028. My bet it'll go probably to 2030 and almost certainly beyond for a number of reasons. But one reason is we're only just starting to reach the full potential of the ISS, right? With the new commercial crew vehicles, the SpaceX capsule and next year the Boeing capsule, and later on in this decade, there'll be additional commercial providers bringing more astronauts up to the space station. Well, now there's more crew time available for scientific research. And so with that extra crew time, we're going to see more scientific productivity, if you will, out of the ISS. So the first 20 years of its existence, yes, there was science done. Yes, it was very important. There was a lot accomplished, but we're only just getting started, people. So I don't think the US Congress and the US government is going to jump the space station before 2030. We have a very exciting decade ahead for the ISS. So what space stations are planned? Well, the United States is building a second space station, and it's around the moon. It's called the Gateway. Contracts have already been let. I'm not sure if metal is being bent yet, but there's a lot of progress already being made on the Gateway space station. It will not be as capable as the ISS. It will be much smaller. It will be intermittently crewed. It won't be permanently occupied, but it is a space station nonetheless. So by 2030, the United States will likely have two space stations, two government-owned space stations. And by the way, I like to distinguish between government-owned stations and commercial stations. That's something I failed to mention earlier. A government-owned station is what it sounds like. It's owned by the government, operated by the government. ISS is a great example. A commercial station, in my opinion, is one that needs to compete for its survival. It needs to generate its own revenue. It doesn't just get a infusion of funding every year like a government station. Okay, moving on to what other space stations are planned. So right, we have the Lunar Gateway. Then the People's Republic of China is building a station. They'll have their first module launched next year. It doesn't have a catchy name yet. First module next year, it'll likely be finished by the middle of the decade. It'll be about a fifth the size of the ISS in terms of mass. And it'll host 3 people. They're already talking about international collaboration on that station, so it might be like a competing international space station. India is also talking about building a space station. Little known fact, they're going to have their first crewed launch is planned for 2022, and then they're talking about building a small station within 5 to 7 years after that. It seems like they're shooting for a 2030 deadline for potential space station. And there's a bunch of highly qualified, exceptionally competent organizations that are talking about building commercial space stations. I list them there. I think we're all familiar with Axiom Space. They are planning to attach a module and have been awarded an empty module port on the ISS. And then they have plans to detach and have a free flyer sometime within the next 10 years. NanoRacks is talking about a very challenging but potentially very promising technology of retrofitting used upper stages to build space stations. Like I said, pretty tricky, but if they get that done, they'll be in a very advantageous position to build stations going forward. Sierra Nevada Corporation, SNC, is experimenting with inflatable modules on the ground. And then Blue Origin in September advertised a job for an orbital habitat formulation lead. So Blue Origin, they're doing suborbital, orbital, they're building a launch site. They built a big factory in Florida. they're building a lunar lander, and now maybe they're getting in the space station business as well. So they're really fleshing out kind of a cislunar space transportation ecosystem. Not surprising, considering Jeff Bezos is a big O'Neillian. And then there's a bunch of others, right? There's a very vibrant startup ecosystem, to use that word again, on space stations. There's a lot of smaller organizations, newer, hungrier organizations trying to build space stations. So we might see a lot by the end of the decade. Okay, well, lots of plans, but how are these space stations going to survive, right? Coming from the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, I like to think a lot about commercial space. And the answer, obviously, for the government stations, as I mentioned earlier, is the taxpayers of their respective nations will support those space stations. Not surprising, but how will the commercial space stations make money? Again, there's going to be a lot of government money to support commercial space stations, at least over the next decade. Why? The ISS will eventually need to be decommissioned. I think it will continue up until 2030 and probably several years thereafter, but eventually it will have to go away. Well, this is the decade that the US government will begin to help commercial space stations prepare for the transition from the time when the money that's currently dedicated for ISS, a portion of that will go to serving NASA's needs on commercial space stations, perhaps sometime in the 2030s. I'm speculating there, but that's my opinion. There'll also be a lot of indirect government funding for commercial space stations. A lot of what we see today where NASA is funding R&D, data sharing, Space Act agreements, other transactional authorities. There'll be a lot of relationships between governments and commercial entities to kind of support this nascent commercial space station industry. However, the market that I really like is here, and I call it government astronauts to commercial space stations. Pretty bullish on this idea. This is the idea of a nation that isn't ready to build its own space station for whatever reason, perhaps cost or complexity, essentially outsourcing their space station needs to a commercial entity. I've done a pretty extensive amount of research on this between my background with the Foreign Service and now commercial space. Pretty good contacts in overseas. And I think this market segment could be pretty lucrative. It could support 1 or 2, maybe even 3 small commercial stations come 2030. There's a big demand overseas to send astronauts to space. You gain a lot of national prestige, and it's very inspiring for the citizens of your particular nation to send one of your citizens to space. Incredibly inspiring for everybody in that country. And I talk a little bit about non-government R&D, manufacturing, tourism. These will all generate revenue for commercial space stations. I don't see any one of these areas supporting a single space station. In other words, I don't think we're going to see exclusively tourist space stations in this decade. I don't think you're going to see a space station dedicated exclusively to manufacturing or private R&D in the 2030s. Happy to have a fight about that. Would love to be convinced otherwise. Would love to be proven wrong. But at this point, I think the costs to deploy and operate and build a space station are just way too high to justify it. All right, we're moving right along here. We talked about what could be. As I said, you know, we're talking about how many space stations we can expect. Well, we've got a handful, right? We're not talking about major numbers of space stations here. But me personally, as I said earlier, I want to see a future where there's dozens of space stations, where there's hundreds of people living in space. It's my goal, my hope, my prayer before I die that there's families being formed in space, that babies are being born in space. That would be really cool. I don't think that's going to happen in the 2020s. I don't think it's going to happen before 2030. So what needs to change for that to actually happen? Well, here, this is what we need. We need a killer app, right? We need a product or service that requires a space station to be, for its construction to be made. And we need that product or service to be demanded by billions of people on Earth, right? We need some sort of product or service that is made on a space station that then gets exported back to Earth and serves huge markets on Earth. There's a lot of breakthroughs. There's a lot of promising research and technology that might become that killer app. I believe Justin mentioned, the advanced fiber optics. The idea I like to talk about is, synthetic human organ transplants that are 3D printed in microgravity on space stations in orbit. There's something like 90,000 people in the United States alone waiting for a kidney right now. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could 3D print kidneys in space and export them back down to Earth? Huge market, very, very high value product, and literally it's saving people's lives. That would be a great killer app. Very tricky to do, very hard to find unobtainium. So let's move on. What other things do we need to facilitate more space stations? We need lower costs, specifically lower transportation costs, which that problem is being solved. I think in this decade, we will see vastly lower transportation costs to orbit. The costs have already come down significantly and they will continue to do so. I'm not saying anything nobody doesn't, that's obvious. Everybody believes that, everybody knows that's coming. So then the other trick is construction costs for space station modules is still very high. And part of the reason it's very high is because there's not too many suppliers that build the components needed for a space station. Let me give you an example. There's really only one supplier for pressure vessels. It's Thales Alenia. Thales Alenia made all the pressure hulls for the U.S. orbital segment on the ISS in the 90s. They made the pressure vessel for the NanoRacks airlock that was just delivered to the space station this week. And they're building the pressure vessels for the Axiom space station modules. So when we talk about infrastructure and encouraging infrastructure, and if I may go so far as to say, if there's some space infrastructure law or legislation, creating a policy to encourage a more diverse supplier base might be a very helpful way to facilitate the construction of more space stations as time goes ahead. Absent government regulation, a very risk-tolerant entrepreneur might say, okay, I see transportation costs are coming down. There might be more demand for, say, government astronauts from third-party nations to go to space. I think there's going to be more space stations. I'm going to start building control moment gyroscopes or software engineering for space stations. If one digs into the cost models for space stations, software engineering is fantastically expensive. You look at the job openings for SpaceX, they're hiring tons of software engineers. So as we know, software is a kind of is the magic, it's the magic bean, it's the magic thing that makes a lot of space work. And the costs are still very high for crewed systems. So more diverse supplier base is I think an easier way to facilitate the construction of more space stations. I think I'm at time. I think that's exactly 20 minutes. So again, I'll leave you with this question. How many space stations should we expect in 2030? So we'll have ISS, we'll have the Gateway, we'll have the Chinese station, that's 3. And then we might have an Indian station. And then I'm gonna say maybe 2 more commercial stations by 2030. So 3 to 6 stations. Right now we have 7 people in orbit. I'm gonna say by 2030, maybe we have 20 to 25 people living in orbit. Not great, I'm not knocking anybody's socks off. A lot better than what we're at right now. But again, really looking for those disruptions, really looking for that policy and that risk tolerance to up the number of space stations and people living in space. Thank you very much. You can email me, tom@beyondearth.org, and I'm happy to take questions.
Right on, Tom. Thank you so much. This is, I think we need that kind of reality check, right? That it's not one, right? It's not one station, right? We're past that, but we're not O'Neill cylinders with 1 million people and herds of elk either, right? So we're at that infrastructure development stage. So I think it's about 10. I'm just going to put it out there that when we have the Blue Marble Week
Not a
10
bad
year,
guess.
yeah. All right. When we have the Blue Marble Week 10-year anniversary, and you come back and you say, okay, what's 2030 to 2040? We're gonna rediscuss this conversation. But so you think less than 50 people, but more than 15 individuals?
Well, yeah, I would say that's about right, because say ISS has 7, Chinese have 3, that's 10. Axiom Space is, they're talking about as many as 16, but I don't see them doing more than 7. I hope I'm wrong. I'm being conservative.
Yep.
So then you're at 17, right? We're kind of getting there. Maybe the Indian space station is about 3, comparable to the Chinese station, I bet. So, right. I don't think 50 would be on the higher end of my estimate. I agree. Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. I'm gonna maintain my optimism, and with the strong hope that there's a couple others out there. But there was a question, I posed it to you the other day. There's a question in the chat. Bigelow Aerospace, are they still in the game? Are they not in the game?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, Bigelow, I really like. I'm bullish on Bigelow, despite the fact that they fired they laid off their entire workforce back in March, reportedly due to COVID.
Right.
But there's other reports that maybe they ran into some funding issues. There are public statements from the CEO that they were looking for more funding, and from the government, from NASA, and but then they didn't even put in a contract because they said the amounts were not sufficient to justify their investment or their time. Let's not forget, Bigelow has deployed 3 commercial space modules.
Right, I'm not counting them out.
I would not count them out at all. And also, we've seen Bigelow do this before, where they've laid off all or most of their workforce. They've gone into hibernation, and then when the situation changes, they come back. Putting on my city planner hat, I was a city planner for a long time. The essence of a successful village, settlement, community is transportation. Bigelow and others are waiting for transportation, and the transportation, it's slowly coming, right? We're seeing progress. We're seeing accelerating progress, but it's not quite ready for that sort of hockey stick progression of more people and more infrastructure in space. And so I think Bigelow, I would not count them out, and I think they're just waiting for the transportation to be fully established. And if they don't do it, somebody is going to acquire their intellectual property, and somebody else will do it, because it's proven, it's working. Yeah. It's on orbit right now.
Yeah, I think if Bigelow just decided to step out of the game altogether, somebody else is going to come in and swoop up not just the IP, but the people who built this stuff that have the experience, because
which is arguably more valuable. The experience, people, yeah, right.
Yeah. So I'm gonna still stay bullish on them. I have a lot of confidence to not count them out. So you had 7, I have 8, just because of that, right? So yeah.
I see a question here, Michael, in the chat room from Kamal. I think that's how I pronounce that name.
Yep.
CubeSat-like revolution of habitable space stations. A generic basic crewable space station. So I don't see that happening in the next 10 years, because even with decreasing costs or prices for people to go to space, it will still be fantastically expensive to have a crew-tended space station, a crewable space station. So the numbers of people in space, as we said, are going to be low. However, this idea of a CubeSat revolution with humans in space, I've been toying around with the idea, and I'd love to continue the conversation with others, with Justin and others who have been on this conference. The idea of a business having kind of a scientist or an astronaut for rent in space. And high schools, universities, corporations could send up an experiment on a CubeSat, on a rack. It can be small. And then they say, okay, I need an hour of that astronaut's time to mix together these test tubes, or smash these two things together, and then send the data back down. So that way you're getting this sort of democratization of human experimentation in space. And I think this is kind of what CASIS is trying to do, I suspect, or if they're not, they should. But if you get a greater demand for crew time, then you're going to get more crew in space, and then you need more space stations. So I think that's an interesting business model that some of these space station companies are probably already trying to figure out. And I could see nanoracks, that's a perfect business model for them because they're already doing it with CubeSats, if I may be so bold.
Expand a bit on your concepts for the national pride angle of XYZ country sending up an astronaut. I mean, that's why we did it. It was a propaganda tool way back when. That's why the Soviets did it. It's a propaganda tool. Certainly China is using it to their strong advantage right now. So what's the value of a nation to send up one of their citizens, and what do they get out of it? And take a wild guess, how much is that worth?
Well, take a wild guess. I mean, how much is it worth to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers, right? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a trite answer, but it's true. If you're a country anywhere really in the world, in this globalized world, but particularly in a rough neighborhood like the Middle East, right? You want to show your neighbors that you're hot stuff, right? You want to show that you have a competent, high-tech, serious workforce. And a clear way to demonstrate that is with a space program. But a space program is really expensive. It's really hard. And there's a lot, Justin talked about minimizing overhead. Well, wouldn't it be great if country XYZ could demonstrate that competence, get the national prestige, get the geopolitical benefits of, hey, look out for us, we're pretty smart,
right?
Without having to actually build a space station, right? They could send their citizen up, they can do some PR stuff, but do some actual science, right? They could have their national universities sending up experimentation. And right, there's the national defense aspect, there's a geopolitical aspect, but I'm more intrigued with the inspirational aspect of it. And I would love to see, for instance, several, say, African nations get together, right? People don't know this, but there are regional blocks all throughout the continent of Africa. And these regional blocks could really have some pretty significant heft and influence. That might be a ready-made framework for, to see more African citizens in space, or citizens of African nations, I should say, go to space. And you can replicate that throughout the world, Southeast Asia, or just individual nations, South Korea, Israel, United Arab Emirates. I think all these countries are good candidates for this sort of business development.
Absolutely. All right, we could spend the entire conversation just on this. FYI, there is a proposal to create a European Space Agency style program within the African continent. So
yes,
that's kind of in development. So all fingers crossed. We're definitely thinking that's a great wild card.
Absolutely.
All right, we are going to keep strictly on time, pass it over to Lila. Tom, thank you so much. It's always
thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Stick around. All right, talk to you later.
I'm gonna mute myself here. Thank you, Tom. Is there a place that you would like to have people reach you? I know you've got a lot of different websites and different initiatives that you do.
I'll put my email in the chat. Yep.
There it is. All right. Anything else that you'd like to mention? Nope.
You guys are doing great. This is really fun. Thanks for doing this. It's really outstanding.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Have a good one.